So you've come from a Rubyist kind of background.
Yeah, absolutely.
And moved into more...
I moved into doing iOS development after Ruby, so soon after the iPhone came out, the company I was working for, I started doing their iPhone development, so late 2008, I think was when I started doing that, and moved pretty quickly into doing that full-time, and then left that company late 2010 and formed my own company, Billu, that I run now in early 2011, and that was really founded around being an iOS development consultancy.
Mm. Yeah. So, having made that transition, but still kind of stayed in touch with the Ruby community, what have you found, like in that of having now watching from the outside? What have you seen? Like,
well, I think look, I'm still very involved in Ruby as a language. Anything that I do that's not iOS is pretty much Ruby. So anything server side that we do, which the vast majority of apps we build require some kind of backend componentry. So, we just finished a job Wednesday of last week that was a reasonably large-ish Rails build with a sort of administrative tools for a client-side front-end app. So, I still use a lot of Rails for that. I, use Rails 4, Rails 3, Rails 3.1, all of those things. So, I just don't really come to Roro anymore because I have a 2.5-year-old kid, so I can't get out at night. But I think one of the big issues for me is, as technologists, I think it's what we focus on is really what my talk is about. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes we focus on the wrong things, and it leads to failures in what it is that we build. And I suppose that is a lot of the crux of what my talk is about.
So is that looking sometimes the classic traps of over-engineering and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it can be engineering too early, like starting to think about engineering too early. I really want to use the latest test framework or we haven't even talked about what we're building yet, and engineers are already kind of trying to find what the latest fun thing is that they can slot into the project. And whilst I think there's a place for that on certain projects, I think that, by and large, the vast majority of projects are about delivering use to people and about really changing people's lives. And, the latest test framework or the latest, database or doesn't really do those things. In certain instances, it absolutely can. So, it's not to say that there is no place for it, but I think sometimes we can choose technology just for the sake of choosing a new technology because it's fun. And that's not to say work shouldn't be fun, but there's a balance there.
Yeah, I remember seeing a tweet describing hipster-driven development.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's certainly a degree of that kind of thing. We saw a lot of it when the NoSQL stuff started, with Couch and Mongo, and just everyone was just use Mongo. And I still remember at the time sitting there going, I don't understand what's wrong with Postgres, guys. Like, I have to model my schema. So spend half a day and model your schema like it. This database is going to work. You're not going to hit scales of economy that really dictate that you need to use Mongo. You're kind of just choosing it because it's cool. It's not actually solving a problem for you.
And how much do you think there is in the Ruby and Rails community? Is there a propensity because of our backgrounds that we sometimes fall into that trap a bit more?
Yeah, I think to a degree. I think it's probably better with the Rails community that, I feel like I sort of have to have this conversation with them because now being an iOS developer, I certainly work with the Java and .NET communities a lot in large enterprises, and it's probably the opposite conversation with them. Like, guys, really, I think you could look at Sass. Like, I think you could look at ways of drying up your CSS or, there are alternatives to what they don't look at all. I think as Rubyists, we can tend to kind of jump on emerging technologies because we did jump on an emerging technology, I bet my entire career on it. I'll talk in a little more detail around that in the keynote about how I came to be using Ruby and whatnot, and my love for the language and sort of what it did for me personally. But, a lot of us hedged our bets on Ruby and on Rails as a framework, and it paid off. And, I just think that there's still needs to be a bit of a degree of investigation in some of these things and not just diving onto the latest and greatest thing and thinking we're always going to win.
I've heard some people say that we've reached peak Rails, that we've reached the top of the mountain and it's kind of going to plateau out from here in terms of adoption. How does that fit with the Rails initially being an early adopter community? It's jumped the chasm and it's now hit at the top of its thing. How do we balance as Rubyists that need to look for what is is new and what's moving forwards. Obviously, Ruby has some significant limitations around parallelism, and that seems to be where we're going in terms of Moore's law. It's not going to keep on going. But how do we balance? What are your thoughts on balancing those two things of watching progress, but also pragmatism for now?
Well, so I mean, I think whatever you're building, you need to sit down and look at what the fundamentals of what you're building are attempting to achieve. So if you're trying to build a website that requires, highly concurrent asynchronous behavior, maybe Ruby isn't a good choice for you. Rather than trying to shoehorn a bunch of background workers into things or offloading things off the main thread in some way or just generally battling the language, maybe you just want to choose a language like Scala or Clojure or something that is just going to jump onto that sort of threaded thing a lot more. I remember a number of years ago now, when I was working in an agency, we did this work where we needed to... Essentially, we were building a Facebook application, but every time you hit the page in the Facebook application, it actually needed to do a bunch of... This was before Open Graph, so it needed to do a bunch of HTTP requests to find out about your friends, the number of photos your friends had, the number of all this kind of stuff. And it turned out there needed to be about 15 HTTP requests per friend that you had. So if you had 400 friends, we were doing sort of 600 HTTP requests in order to render the HTML page. Now, I'm sorry, but Ruby's not doing that. It's not doing it. And we investigated a bunch of languages, and we actually ended up writing the thing in Erlang. And to this day, I still can't really think of anything that would do that aside from Erlang. And Erlang did a superb job of it. It did it really well. But Erlang was a nightmare to deal with strings, and it was a nightmare at the time to deal with HTML templating and all of that kind of stuff. So what we actually did was wrote a socket server in Erlang that dealt with all of those things, and a Rails front end that communicated to the socket server. So when a request came in, it made a request down to the Erlang server, which went out and fetched everything, map reduced all of the JSON responses, and sent a single JSON response back to the Rails thing with all of the information that we needed, and we rendered the page. And it worked really, really, really well. It was really successful. But it was really about choosing the right tools for the job and not just simply going, I'm a Rails programmer, how can I solve this with Ruby? It was more, I'm an engineer, how do I solve this problem? And I think that's more, we need to view ourselves as engineers trying to solve problems, not as Rubyists writing Ruby, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And what is it, I suppose you have a nice spot in terms of being a keynoter, so you get everyone's attention. But what is it that, as people walk out of your talk, what is it you really want them to take away?
Well,
without of course,
giving away the punchline naturally. Well, I mean, the first thing I want them to appreciate is Lachlan Hardy's hair. So it will be featured in the keynote.
Excellent.
Some of you may have noticed that the photo of me on the Ruby conference homepage, I think maybe up until today, I haven't actually checked today, but is actually a very old photo of me that Tim Lucas took in about 2008, I think. So it's somewhat misleading to, I'm not nearly that young these days, and I do not have that hair, and I do not wear those shirts anymore. But Lachlan Hardy, I believe, was responsible for that. So he's making quite an appearance in my keynote. And not to mention, actually, that there are a few actual pivotal moments in my career, and in fact, that leads me onto my thinking about product and engineering and software that Lachlan was actually heavily involved in. And so... I think a deep appreciation for Lachlan Hardy's hair will certainly be coming out of the keynote, amongst other things. That is not what you do as programmers, by the way.
You don't just do your hair?
No, definitely not. No, okay. There's more to it. Yeah, there's beards as well.
There's beards. Well, I mean,
absolutely. Yeah.
This needs more care.
No, well, I just can't grow one, so yeah. Hence the reason I run a business now.
Thank you so much for your time. That's very enlightening, and I look forward to your talk.
Absolute pleasure, and I hope everyone is inspired by the end of the keynote.